Okay, so welcome to tonight's webinar. We're going to be talking about navigating puberty. We have with us As I Am's very own Niamh Mellerick. Niamh's worn a lot of hats in As I Am. She was, I would say originally, but I'm sure you had a job before I came here, the head of the information line. And then she was the head of child and family. And now she is the director of operations. She's an OT by background and has worked at SIM and in special schools. So there's a lot of different backgrounds to bring into this topic. Um, and she will occasionally be asking me questions during the presentation. My name's Brighid Farrell. I work on the information line and I'm an autistic adult. So I'll be sharing some of my stories from my own teenage life, which are difficult to look back on. Um, so I'm going to let Niamh get started. Feel free to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A and name them out as we go, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A at the end.
Okay, great stuff. Brighid, is my screen sharing okay?
Yep.
Lovely. Okay, I will make a start because lots to get through and want to get through as much as I can. So thank you, Bea, for that lovely introduction and interaction. I'm also very aware we can't figure out why my lighting is incredibly strange tonight. So I look like a fake person, and like I'm AI, but I'm not, and we just couldn't figure it out. So here I am. But yes, I'm actually probably imagining I know a lot of you on the call. You're probably a lot of parents I have met before, and equally might be a lot of parents or carers that I haven't met before. I probably have, supported hundreds of autistic children and families with puberty at this point in a range of different settings and in a range of different ways. So I will speak to that experience, but also speak to the perspectives that have been given to me by a range of autistic children, teenagers, and adults. And I'll also reference As I Am's teenage resource, which is called Teenage Years as We Are. And we would have written that back in summer 23, actually, by the time it got done. And it was supported by a range of autistic young people and autistic adults with drawings and poetry by children as well. And Brighid will send that out in the resources that go out after the webinar. But in terms of, and we can link it on socials as well. But I suppose in terms of some of the topics I touch on, you can read about them at length within that teen resource, and the resource is written directly to the teenager. So you could download one chapter for your young person. You might want to give them the whole lot, and it's quite a chunky one as well. So I leave you guys to read that. So if you've been to a webinar with me before, you are probably switching off at this point because I always say it, but I just think it's very important, especially as I like to give a lot of examples. And if you don't know me, you might think I'm expecting you to implement lots of different examples. So we're going to lean into the fact that puberty is a time of major change and transition for the young person. So when we think about then introducing strategies, introducing solutions, and these might be things that the school recommends, that your OT recommends, your SLT, your psychologist, if you're lucky enough to be working with one of them, that you see on Instagram, that you see in a reel. And it can be tempting, especially when you know that your child is finding something really challenging, to put a whole lot of things in place at once. But I would be mindful of it's very difficult then to kind of see what's made the difference for one thing. And it's also, if you say, okay, from Monday, we're using visual schedules, we're using timers, we're using whichever, that's very hard for your lifestyle and your routine suddenly to adjust. And then you burn out from those strategies. And then the thing that I think always gets missed in presentations around autistic young people is we'll spend the whole presentation saying, be careful about unpredictability and bringing changes to routine, but do all these new things to support your child. So it's just that piece of remembering that a well-intentioned, likely effective strategy is still a change to a daily routine. And that's just something to mind. And also take the guilt off of, oh, actually, I've just implemented one thing that was suggested this evening. And what's the most important thing I want to come away with? So if you come away with 2 things you're going to try in the next month, that is plenty. This is being recorded. You can go back to the resource. So I would just keep that in mind. And I suppose the buffet piece comes from, I literally picture it like a breakfast buffet, saying, not for me, not for me. I'm going to say things that you'll be like, that has no relevance to my child. They would never access that. And that can be frustrating to listen to as well. So tune that out and just take the bits that are relevant to you. I suppose my second and last disclaimer then is, I notice in a lot of the resources around puberty, the advice is always start as early as you can. Okay. And naturally, that would be advice or information that I would give tonight. So I suppose, for example, when I was working in a special school setting in the UK, we would have had talks on puberty or body changing and those kind of topics from early years up to 18. And you might be thinking, what could you possibly be telling the parents of the early years kids? Plenty, actually. And it enabled those parents to, I suppose, put in place things that would support those later years. And that's great if that's where you are now, if your child is kind of 10, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. But also, I'm really aware there's going to be a lot of parents and carers on the call that their child is right in the thick of puberty, 15 or 16, and you can end up feeling more stressed by the time the talk is over if the absolute emphasis is on all these things you're expected to do from 5 years. And it really reminds me, I was not studious in school. I was a chancer and I did literally just enough to get by. People are always surprised that I was quite bold in school, but alas, I was. I would hate to teach me. But anyway, the point being that I remember in third year and sixth year, early doors and maybe the first term, we had in a study skills person who came in and did a great talk on what you're supposed to do, and I ignored all that. And then in the final term they came in again, and I remember it was probably the only 2 things that I kind of remember in school filling me with panic, because it was speaking to all that I hadn't done. And it was probably maybe that was the desired effect and it gave me a bit of a kick. But I remember thinking, when he was referencing these lists I should have been keeping and all of these things, what's the point? Because everyone was putting up their hands saying, well, this is what I've been doing for fifth and sixth. And I was just thinking, there's no point me starting now because I'm never going to catch up. So I will speak to things that are useful for a younger child as I go, but also bear in mind there are also points where I'll speak to things you can do right now. Because that's the last feeling I want you to go away with. And it's one of those, you do what you can with what you know at that time. If I thought back to strategies I would have used 10 years ago as an OT, I'd cringe for my life, and I would never use them now. But obviously my knowledge has evolved. So likewise, your knowledge as a parent or a carer of an autistic young person has evolved as well. And what was available 3 years ago isn't the same as what's available now. So take the guilt off there. Okay. In terms of why puberty is challenging for an autistic young person, I don't think that's exactly why there's probably people here at the webinar tonight. I think you've probably tracked that and the areas that your child is probably finding difficult or that you worry about that they will find difficult. And I think it's because everyone on the call in some form or fashion went through puberty themselves and remembers that it was overwhelming, and the amount of change that was involved, different feelings they had, relationships changing, etc. So I think it's quite easy to then go a little bit further and think, yeah, that might be quite challenging for my young person. That's not a big jump. But when I was trying to boil it down in my head, I actually thought about something I really hadn't thought about previously in terms of, for the child and young person, right? They have grown up in a majority neurotypical society, and we know that are non-autistic anyway. And they have, it mightn't be something that delights your child, but unfortunately they've had to get used to the fact that their environment is always changing for ways they may not understand. So if your child transitioned from creche to primary school, but at that time didn't have the language or so on for you to explain that change, it must have been a real shock to the system suddenly being in a different setting. If your child was very attached to their teacher in junior infants and or their SNA, and then that SNA moved away, they may have taken that loss, a little bit more challenging than someone else. We know that the environment is constantly changing for an autistic child or young person, and that's something that might drain. If you were on the energy accounting talk with Maya last week, that might be something that really, really drains their battery and leads to a lot more fatigue or maybe meltdowns, etc. I'm not saying anything groundbreaking here, but I think the bit that we sometimes miss is for the autistic young person when they get to puberty. And it hit me when I asked a friend of mine last week, why was puberty difficult for you as an autistic woman? And she said, my body turned against me. And it made me think because her body was something that she relied on to be predictable. So she knew when her mum played the Hoover that it hurt her ears. She knew her ears were sensitive to noise. So it wasn't that she was saying, oh, my body was so perfect pre-puberty. She was actually saying, I wished my ears weren't quite so sensitive. But she knew when there was a loud noise, her ears would hurt. And suddenly your body is feeling things more strongly. Your body is feeling things less strongly. Your body is looking different. Your body is feeling different. And all of that. And perhaps the one thing you've been able to control in your environment, which is how your body feels, you mightn't have always been happy about how it feels, suddenly is out of your control as well. So you're in an environment that doesn't feel very predictable, doesn't always feel like it's something you can control, and doesn't always feel like the people or the adults in it understand that this is evolving for you all the time and how challenging that is. And then next thing, your body suddenly doesn't feel under your control, doesn't feel something that you can predict, and the people around you can't seem to see why that's doubly stressful. So that to me, I think summarizes in a way why puberty, as a kind of a take-home message, I think is particularly challenging for the autistic young person. It's not always just, oh, they don't understand the body changes or they have a sensory difference. And I will speak to all of those things. But actually it's that one thing that perhaps the young person feels that they could rely on suddenly feels out of their control as well. And B, I might just, from your perspective, what would you say were the main challenges for you in puberty? Two or three that you feel comfortable to share.
I think similar to your friend, there was um I had this understanding that I had like figured out how to be a person finally, that like I'd been doing this for 11, 12 years. I'd figured out quite a bit. And then they added a whole bunch of extra steps. They completely changed how my body worked. I don't know who they is, the universe, I
Yeah.
guess. Um, like the things that I thought I had figured out about taking care of myself, the little bits of independence I thought I had gained were not relevant anymore. And it felt like starting from scratch. It also felt like something everyone had explained to them when I was out. Like when you miss the one lesson and suddenly nothing makes sense in math anymore. Like everyone,
Mhm.
no one else seemed to be struggling with it in the way that I was. And I was in um, mainstream school, so I tended to stand out with the failings in self-care that I would occasionally have.
Mhm.
And that meant like bullying that I thought I had grown out of, or bullying that I had gotten used to changed and became more apparent again. Um, it's also partnered with a time in your life where you're suddenly given more expectations. So
Mm,
I'm starting from scratch. I don't know how to take care of myself anymore. No one's willing to tell me what I'm supposed to be doing. And suddenly I'm supposed to like get a job in my spare time
hmm.
and be figuring out what I want to do with my life and studying for tests that change my ability to get into certain schools. And at the time, I was doing all of this without a diagnosis, and it just seemed to be so overbearing. And that I couldn't
Hmm.
even get my body to work was just so devastating.
Thanks, B. And I think, what Bridget speaks to there, because I'm sure for some of the parents on the call who are thinking, my God, this sounds like this is going to be a terrible time for my young person. And then you can feel helpless in that. But I think what comes through from Bridget there and from having previous conversations on this is almost how alone she felt in that, that she had missed the lesson where this had been explained. And people kind of say very, off the cuff, puberty needs to be explained to young people, but we
Yeah.
really need to kind of delve into that a bit deeper of how that might work for an autistic young person and how the key adults in their life are involved in that. And I think to boil it down, and again, the barriers or the needs that your child has in the area of sensory already. Okay. So you know that they struggle to have their hands dirty. And that probably has told you that they're quite tactile sensitive. Okay. You know that they really struggle with the smells of foods and that they will uh, gag or they will leave the table. So they can be quite avoidant of smell. Um, the reason I'm saying this is because it allows you to almost think about either what will be challenging for your child or what is at the moment in puberty. So if they are someone who's quite avoidant of smell, for example, and you know that already when you think about sense of smell, okay, how does that usually work for my kid? You can imagine things that could be potentially difficult for them, for example, would be smelling BO on their own body and be hypersensitive to that, or hypersensitive to BO of other people or body odor. If they, or, and again, I will say the one of the biggest thing with supporting an autistic young person through puberty is being as explicit as possible. So I'm going to be explicit in my language that I use. So if a child has their period and finds the smell of that very challenging as well, are they going to be more sensitive and more fearful of having their period as well? So the reason I'm giving these examples is you're not starting again. I'm sure you and your child, you're either supporting them with it in a way that they may not be aware of. They maybe just be aware that, mom is the person or dad is the person that protects them, or it might be in a way that you discuss it. But you know what the sensory barriers are for your child. Is your child someone who think things often go into their mouth and they would mouth a lot of items, non-edible items, and they seem to get a lot of feedback from that? You might think about, would they be likely then in terms of touching more intimate areas where they're going to get feedback? So it's thinking about, okay, instead of feeling like I don't know what's coming at me, I don't know what's going to happen when the magical or awful um hormones hit, actually thinking, well, no, I've put so much time and resources in understanding and protecting my child. So let me just think about some of the upcoming barriers that I can think are coming my way. From a social point of view as well, there's lots of discussion on this. When a child is in primary school, particularly for girls, they're kind of swept up in the group, and they might be on the fringes of the group, but playtime is play-based, stating the obvious. So it's playing, chasing, playing football. We need five on that side. We need five on that side. It doesn't really matter who. Obviously, when you come into adolescence, friendships can become a lot more one-on-one and a lot more discussion-based. And it can also, I suppose, become less so around, this big indiscriminate group, and more so Mary is my best friend and Jimmy is not my best friend. And everyone on this call is going to probably remember some kind of, you know, not nice moment as a teenager when someone said, "You're not my best friend anymore," so on and so forth. And I include myself, I was saying it too. But again, that social environment does change. And again, the benefit of knowing that in advance is really, really helpful when it comes to things like, okay, so if friendships are going to become a lot more currency like and are going to be based on discussion or one-on-one, and that might be something that your child might fear or so on. Well, what are the different ways of socializing that you're looking at? If they have a real interest in chess, for example, it's much easier for that more intense activity when you're doing something, or parallel play that we still see in teenagers and adults. So again, it's thinking of that social environment is changing for everyone, and a lot more invisible rules are coming in. And I'm going to come back to that. Executive functioning then, and I've done a whole webinar on this previously, I think last year, which would be on the YouTube channel. But again, it's that piece of how we start a task, how we transition through a task, and how we conclude a task, and how we remember every step that we're doing. I'm going to talk about this further, but a lot of our self-care and our hygienes, like showering, washing your hair, they are multiple steps. If you struggle with time blindness, how long something is going to take, that can be really quite exhausting. When it comes to puberty, you're already finding school pretty tough. And now you got to remember that you got to put deodorant on every morning, and you got to remember that you need to change your tampon every couple of hours. All of these things drain the old battery. And then finally, I wanted to flag as well that I'm very aware for many parents on the call, yes, their child is autistic, but they may also be ADHD, they may be dyspraxic, they may have an intellectual disability. So I will make sure that I'm giving examples that kind of go across autism, plus maybe having a co-occurring neurodivergence as well. And I have kind of examples mapped into my head for how I will do that. So that puts us into that lens of, I know my child very well. I'm able to recognize what their sensory, their social, their executive functioning barriers are, where they currently are. So actually, it's not all going to be a massive surprise to me. I can probably predict what some of these things are going to be, or I can now understand why they might be a little more difficult as well. Okay, so I just wanted to speak to that predictability piece, and I actually haven't used this slide in a couple of years. I used to love using it, and then I think I like novelty. I forgot about it and started doing different things. Um, I'm going to go on, and Bridget spoke to that of piece of not having the answers, not having the information she required, and the power of predictability for an autistic child in a very unpredictable environment, with a body that has now become suddenly unpredictable as well. And I think you're like, yeah, I'm at my 55th As I Am webinar. You get it. Predictable routines, habits. I get the drift. But I think if you're someone who thinks they're not necessarily impacted by unpredictability, it is hard to empathize, I suppose, to the extent to which this will support your child, or not empathize, or I suppose reflect on the extent it will support your child. And I always think this is a nice way of bringing it home. So, we've all done the stupid thing when we're on our way home from somewhere. It's work, it's winter, it could be a later evening, etc. And we walk down the dark alley. And as we're walking down the dark alley, we're thinking, oh my God, this was a silly thing to do. I should have got a taxi, but now I'm halfway down the alley. And when a pipe you move against the wall and a pipe rubs off your arm, you are going to leap in the air, but you haven't suddenly developed tactile sensitivity. Okay, we're talking as if you don't have tactile sensitivity. And if it was bright and you could see everything and the sensation of a pipe, you leaned against it, you would never jump. So why do you jump when a leaf brushes off you, when you're in the dark, etc.? You're in flight or fright. You are expecting you're in danger because you're in an environment you don't feel safe. We know that so many autistic kids don't feel safe outside of their home, especially. They don't feel safe in school. They might not feel safe at their first sleepover, etc. So their system is dialed up like yours might be when you're walking through a lane. It is that feeling of shoulders up, I don't know what's coming. If a car alarm went off or whichever it was, again, you are going to jump in the air. Whereas if an alarm went off now, I'm in my office, I'm very safe, I would be irritated because it would affect my webinar, but I would not jump. So I'm not suddenly sound sensitive. My OT sensory profile doesn't change in a dark lane. My system is fired up, so I'm going to take jolts to it. It's a little bit, if you think about like being on the bus on the way to an interview and the sound of someone's chewing, making you literally feel like I'm actually going to lose my mind. And then on the way back from the interview, you're relaxed, you're tired. Someone is listening to music with no AirPods, and you only realize when you get off the bus because you're zonked. So that unpredictability of feeling that feeling in your body, in your environment, is going to lead to a bigger sensory response. So it's not necessarily that you're always sensitive to these things, but that could be a part, yes, but also your body is primed for danger. If I was walking down this lane, I wouldn't suddenly be thinking about, okay, when I get home, I really need to make sure I hop in the shower. Oh God, I better make sure I bring that envelope in for Rebecca tomorrow. My mind would be focused on the danger I'm in. It wouldn't leave much room for what do I need to do next? What are my steps? So my executive functioning is going to be impacted as well. And I certainly, if a stranger walked alongside me saying, hey, have you seen the recent Bridget Jones? I would feel too unsafe to engage in conversation. Even if I knew that person wasn't going to hurt me, I would be thinking, this environment doesn't feel safe. I wouldn't be at my funniest. I wouldn't be at my best position to make a new friend. So when we're in an unpredictable environment, everything is more challenging. And then to see the flip of that. So I kind of think about this as if you are explaining the changes to your client's body, the changes to their environment in a way that is meaningful to them. Now flip the experience of you're walking down this lane, right? And you know that window to the left is going to bang. You would not have the same reaction. So you have been told about a noise that's going to be there. You have been told when you rip the pad from your knickers, that is going to make quite a loud noise, okay? The pipe will bang against your arm. If you knew that, then you wouldn't jump, even though you're in the dark lane, because you know that was coming. So if I think about then letting someone know if your pad is used and you are, an hour or two in, you're going to feel a sensation of wet on your legs. That doesn't mean that you have wet yourself. If you think of a person who has a wet dream and they wake up and they have a stain on their pajamas or on their feet, the difference in knowing that to thinking that you have wet yourself or thinking that something is wrong with you is going to be massive. And we'll talk about how we navigate those kind of tricky conversations as well. Again, I'm just giving examples. If I knew the walk was going to take 30 seconds, if I knew how long it was going to take me to shave my face, this uncomfortable sensation will be finished in 30 seconds. It doesn't mean that the sensation isn't uncomfortable, but there's a parameter to it. And the big one, and I'll talk back to this, the person you can rely on to give you the information that you need, that's not always just obvious to everyone. It isn't obvious to everyone if I did a leak in school, it would make sense that it's my year head or the receptionist I go to ask for an extra tampon. That isn't where you might have a social imagination difference. that isn't always obvious. So knowing who's the person who helps you, who explain things, is so, so important. And you might be surprised that you think, actually, definitely know that. Not necessarily, because that's actually quite a complex social piece, invisible social piece to pick up. And I'm thinking of an exact incident where a young girl I know got into this scenario, and she went into the bathroom and she was really panicked to come out. And she had her phone in her bag, but she didn't text her mom because she knew she wasn't allowed to use her phone. So she's a rule follower. So when she got into her mom's car, she burst into tears and she explained, I didn't know what to do. I got tissue. And the mum said, why didn't you just ask, Miss O'Shea? And again, she just assumes that's something, that I'm sure she knows. But actually, it changed how we worked with some of the teachers in that setting, because we actually asked the teachers to just explicitly say on the first day to the first years, if you need a tampon or you need whatever, I'm the person that you come to, or you're asking that to find out who the person is. So what I'm really getting at there is the person that will come to your assistance and will help. And that's going to be communicated differently depending on your child's needs and communication preferences. But again, I hope what I've really brought home there is every time I speak to predictability here, just think of yourself, the difference of these two experiences for you, if you had all the information that you needed to navigate. And I suppose on that, this is a really important slide to me, and probably half and half. A lot of it comes from working with kids with very diverse needs, but there's also a focus here where the child might have higher support needs in the area of cognition and might have an intellectual disability. But I think you can go across the board. So when I say protection, I think when your child is going through puberty, one of the big worries is, and it speaks to that piece that Brighid would have mentioned of someone having a little bit more independence, and are they then more exposed to more risk? So one thing that you'll hear talked about a lot is that concept of public versus private. And again, I'm going to be quite explicit here. So, you might expect that when your child hits puberty or at a certain age, they may start to masturbate, okay? And you might have thought them, for example, that the toilet is an okay place for them to masturbate, in the concept of, well, the toilet is a private place. Or, if their hands go down their pants, you might say, Jimmy, you need to go to the toilet if you want to do that. Because obviously, and I think I touch on this on one of the slides, but I'll come to it in a minute, you're not going to block that sensory need, obviously, because, that child is looking for a release of some sort. But this, and I've seen this happen, can put a child in a vulnerable situation in a public toilet or in a school toilet. So it's less thinking about, you can just go to the toilet to do that, or she can just go to the toilet to do that. And actually thinking about, and that might be supported with visuals, that might be supported with AAC, what we can do in public versus what we can do in private. And actually a child having that private time as well, regardless of their level of need. And obviously there's a safety implication as well for some children. But what is the best possible outcome in terms of that child having some alone and private time, and teaching that concept of that being in your bedroom as a private space? And I know that is difficult where you might have siblings sharing a room. And again, your child may not understand, it isn't appropriate that they would masturbate in the bedroom that they're sharing with a sibling. So, but actually, that's not something that might be obvious to you from a cognitive point of view, or also from the conversations your friends are having. And I'm going to come back to that. I'll just stay, because it comes up a lot. Often when the hands are going down the pants, people are very tempted to say, hands out, hands out, hands out of the pants. And of course, I understand that from a vulnerability for your child, a vulnerability of the children around them. But it comes back to that piece. If you block a sensory need, it doesn't go away. your body wants you to crave that feedback in another way. So I worked with a child, and he was actually very young when he would be regularly putting his hands down his trousers, and he was told, you know, hands out, hands out. And instead, what he started doing was tapping himself, which actually became kind of more ritualistic and so on. And I suppose it wasn't, he was back in, I suppose, a behavior era of, you know, if you put your hands down your pants, then you will lose your train or whatever it was. So he knew, I don't want to lose my train, so I know what not to do this, but the sensory need wasn't going anywhere. So your child is looking for tactile stimulation there, and they have figured out that their penis is a much more sensitive area than their fingertips, so, and has way more receptors. So from a logical point of view, makes a lot of sense. In the same way the mouth has a lot of receptors, so your child, when they were younger, or still may currently, will put something in their mouth because it's something that's almost thought of as kind of developmentally lower, but it's actually very instinctive, if, especially if you don't have good fine motor skills, to look for areas where you have more responsive receptors if you don't have the best fine motor skills. So again, it's thinking about that piece of, there's going to be things that might shock, and you think, dear God, he can't be doing that in public. And maybe the first time you're on a bus and you think, hands out, we cannot be, we're going to get kicked off the bus or whatever. And I have worked with kids where this has been the case on the bus and so on. But I think once you kind of get over the shock of that, it's the working with the school or working with your family around, okay, when that happens, what is the replacement there? Is it that we have the best fidget that he owns, that he gets a lot of tactile stimulation to give as an interim until the child can have some privacy? But just we can't be putting down our hands down our pants, especially if it's abstract to the child of why, is something that's going to end up then causing stress. Knocking is an interesting one, I think, because often where the child has higher support needs, the concept of knocking isn't there. So when you go into your child's room, you mightn't be in the habit of knocking. When you remember yourself slightly when you got to the stage where, like, God forbid, your parent didn't knock on your bedroom. It was like, I can't believe you would be such a criminal to even think about coming into my room without knocking. So we often follow our child's cue for that, if that makes sense. The parent doesn't think, you know what, I'm gonna start knocking now on Bridget's room. It's often the child is saying, you to knock, or putting up a sign, etc. The child developmentally mightn't actually, communicate, hey, mom, I want you to knock. And you might be thinking this is quite silly because Jimmy doesn't care, or Jimmy doesn't notice that I don't knock. That's not actually what my point is about there. It's about, from a vulnerability point of view, your child learning, especially when they're in a state of undress, that an adult knocks before they come in. So it isn't really about you. It is about them associating someone coming into my private space, they knock before they come in. Now, there may be times you have to go in if you think that your child is at risk, or perhaps, you're supervising them in the bath and all of that. But it is getting the child into the habit of thinking something is not good if I don't get a knock before an adult comes into my room, because that's something that I suppose puts them in a place of more vulnerability. On that as well, in terms of our instincts, and speaking to a variety of needs here, there's a big trend of kind of desensitization for a few years, right? On, if she gets used to the noise, she wouldn't need those ear defenders or so on. And I'm always mindful of that, particularly with young girls, but also with boys, that piece of teaching a child, if something doesn't feel good, if the other person says it feels fine, then don't worry. And you need to follow their cues and their advice. And don't be difficult and say that X and Y doesn't feel good. That doesn't put someone in a good place when it comes to something like coercion or relationships, etc. So again, I'm always mindful when it comes to sensory that an autistic young person isn't left with the idea that they have a bad read of an environment, and that the environment was fine for everyone else, so why wasn't it fine for them? So that is just something to think about, I suppose, from a sensory point of view. Go away from puberty altogether. Not having, you'll see a lot of old school IEPs where the target is for the child to stay in the assembly as long as possible, right? And that's problematic, because if the child is only staying in the assembly for as long as possible because they get their iPad after, they're going against what their body is telling them, and that this room is too loud for me. And they're actually saying, no, what's wanted is for me to put myself through this. Now, obviously, if you're, I don't know, in the emergency department, it is very difficult for you to control the environment, and you might be saying to your child, it's okay, I know it's noisy, but it's okay, etc. But again, it's just something to think about from that vulnerability point of view. Also, get outs. We go into the teen resource in quite a lot of depth on this, and that's for good reason. And this is, again, thinking of a young person who might be out in the road, or who might be out without you, right? So a child that doesn't have you there is socializing without you, or is in school without you, and perhaps doesn't have an SNA or kind of someone closely watching how they're getting on. We learn in our teenage years how to get out of a difficult, a situation where we're a bit out of our depth. So I was never really allowed to stay out late, and again, I was quite bold, so I used to just turn my phone off, so that I didn't get the call. But when I'd start to think, right, I've really pushed it, because maybe my friends were allowed to stay out till 12 and I was only allowed, I wouldn't have been allowed to stay out till 12 or like 13, whatever. I knew I had to be home for 6, and I turned my phone off and it was now 8. I wouldn't say, oh, I actually was meant to be home for 6. I would tell a white lie and say, I'm not feeling very well, or I'm over this, I'm bored, I'm going to go home. And yes, I'm not saying that that's a really good strategy. And I think if we all think back to our teenage years, we developed an ability to sometimes just get out of a situation when we need to. And yes, I am all for, if your teenager is empowered to be able to say, I don't want to drink, no thank you. I've no interest in drinking, no thank you. Then Christ, don't discourage that. Like, what a skill to learn in your teenage years. But on the flip, I don't think it's a necessarily reasonable expectation for a teenager to stand up against the man, especially if you think about how good were you at doing that when you were younger. But if your child has, interacts differently socially, and also might be very, very focused on, well, I can't say I have a sore tummy because I don't have a sore tummy. There is, and again, this is something that's nuanced. It's not me saying teach your child to lie. But there is that piece of teaching if you're at your friend's house and you want to come home, but you don't want to say, ring my mom, you can say to your friend, I've left X and Y at home. And this kind of comes to the word of mouth piece. If your child is struggling with friends, so I don't remember my mom telling me one thing about, I'm sure she must have, but I don't remember my mom talking to me about sex or what different slang words meant, etc. I picked them up by pretending I knew what they meant in conversation, and then kind of working backwards and thinking that's probably it. If your child doesn't feel they're in a social group, or might be a little bit on the fringes, it isn't their fault that they're not getting that same education, if you get me. So they might be hearing the word boner, for example, but they may not have a person that they, a best friend that they can say, does that actually mean? I didn't know what the boys were talking about at break, or so on. So it's thinking around ways, and the teenage resource has a lot of that slang written down, of describing words that a kid might not want to ask their parent. Maybe they have a sibling who would be more comfortable speaking to them. Maybe they have that great relationship with you. And it might mean that you have some slightly different conversations with your teenager than you might have had with your other teenager who's non-autistic. But again, there's a vulnerability to that. And it's not forgetting that a lot of that know-how and getting out of a situation and knowing what words mean comes from learning through friends, and it's thinking about this might be a little bit trickier for my child because of not having a friend group. So how am I going to supplement that, if that makes sense? And if you think boner, wet dream, all of those words, like, to a literal thinker, what does that mean? And where are you getting that information safely? So it's just a little, I suppose, something that I think is important to think about. And on that, I touched on the language piece, where I think Irish people, and I'm like, I'm not, Bridget knows me, I don't think I could ever be described as crude. It's not like I'm, walking around making jokes about all these things, etc. But I actually learned this from when I was working in special school from a nurse who came in to train us, and I just never forgot it. And I literally changed my practice the next day. So I was running three different girls groups for teenagers with different needs, and it literally was like overnight change. So we would have avoided, I remember one of the girls asked what's an orgasm, and we were like, move on. Or we would have used kind of different words for penis. We would have used words like private parts. But actually, again, for a child who might be not having that word of mouth piece, or a child who is a literal thinker, it's really important to use the words that are the names of the body parts and to not avoid those words. Further to that, if your child is a bit more vulnerable and might have a communication difference, God forbid if something was to happen to them, in terms of letting somebody know or being able to share a situation that made them uncomfortable, how can a person do that if, they've been given all these fake words for body parts that's made them confused about different parts of their bodies? The other piece to think about here is, when we talk about private parts, we often just refer to our bikini areas. So we often teach so if you think, if I was here in a bikini, though if I was here in a bikini in a webinar, I'd be in some kind of nightmare and probably in therapy afterwards. But if I was here in a bikini, right, we can all picture the bikini areas of a body, and they would be the areas that we traditionally teach don't touch. But actually, that's not real. That's not, well, not realistic. That's not the truth. Because if you were in work and you had your AirPods in and someone came up to get your attention, and they got your attention by touching your thigh, you would be so weirded out. Really, the only place for strangers that we want to touch us or that we expect is a tap on the shoulder. A head we find strange. Really, I actually think it's just shoulder to elbow that is actually where we think is okay to be touched, unless it's somebody that we know. So if we're just teaching, you don't, if someone touches you here or here or here, there's something wrong, that is not protecting the child, because actually being touched on the thigh is not something we would expect. The mouth is important here. So a lot of children who might have speech differences, where they are, the therapist in speech and language is holding on to their mouth, we would have changed our touch policy to be that every therapist had to ask the child before they touched their mouth, because again, we were teaching that as a way of safeguarding or protecting that child. Immediately when this was discussed in the school, it was, well, what about the children who are non-speaking, which is the majority of that school? And we would have worked with the speech and language therapists on how they could communicate yes or no, whether it was through visual, AAC, etc. But again, children who've gone through a lot of speech and language, a lot of OT, are more used to maybe adults they don't know being like, lie up here on this peanut ball, I'm going to grab your face and help you articulate the sound G, I'm going to move your lips to help you blow the bubbles, etc. But again, how do you then differentiate when that's okay and when that's not okay? And final point on the this slide, because I actually think this one, I have a real interest in it, and as I has such an interest in this area that we actually applied for funding, and we are partnering with T4CC to do a large research project, or it was large, probably a bit of a stretch, a research project on, autistic young people's and adults' experiences around consent and learning consent, and autistic adults' experience of sex. So it's an area we're really keen to highlight. And one of the reasons we're so keen to highlight it is the sex ed piece. So we would have done focus groups with parents who said, you know, in terms of the sex ed in their child, and this is all autistic children, things like, you know, if you lie down beside a man, you're going to be pregnant. Obviously, for a young person who might hop into their parents' bed on a Saturday morning to watch Netflix, that's going to be really confusing. And I was really shocked to hear just how behind some of the sex ed was. So, in the same way that you might speak to your teacher about, you know, I want to make sure Jimmy's able to access assembly, I want to make sure Jimmy's able to access sports day. If you know your child is having sex ed in school, I would really say to the teacher, can I just ask? And I'm sure so many teachers, one, they either think of it and they're brilliant at it, or two, they don't think about it because it hasn't come up before as an issue. So two is probably going to be your biggest posse, and then three, where there might be some barriers, but obviously there's advocacy there to say, you know, how is this going to be adjusted for my child? And similarly, if your child is in a special school or autism class, their body is changing just the same as the teenager in the class along the corridor. So why would they be excluded from learning about their body changes in a way that is accessible and meaningful to them? And similarly on the policy, if your child does get a lot of therapy where touch is used, asking, can I just ask about the school's touch policy in terms of consent for if they're having speech and language that uses their face? And there's a way to do it that you're not implying there's anything untoward, but literally how I just explained, you're trying to protect and safeguard your child and develop their understanding as they move through. Sorry, that is a long one. This is a slightly shorter one, but I'm just going to have a quick look. And oh, the audio is coming and going. I'm hoping it's back in. Let me see. I will move a little bit closer, and hopefully that makes it a little bit easier. And Bridget might let me know if it persists. Let's see then on the Q&A and sharing. Yeah. Okay, and same on feed on audio as well. Okay. If it persists, what we can do is there any questions on the end and anything I've missed, I am happy to speak to, and we'll certainly send the recording out afterwards as well with the transcript. Okay. I'm mindful of time. One of the things that comes up quite a lot is yeah, this is all very good, but you know, I really do need to make sure that my child is showering, and you know, where I mightn't want them to be bullied, for example. You know, not I mightn't, no one wants their child to be bullied. And I'm worried about if they don't shower or they don't, so on, and that's going to be really, really put them in a more vulnerable position. And it's often described as that you have to, but actually the outcome is for their body not to smell, right? If we take hygiene, that's what you want. You want them not to smell of BO, or maybe not to have hair that looks like it hasn't been washed. And there are different ways to do that that aren't always the shower. And I know that sounds like obviously needs, but that's the difference between what are the solutions or the adjustments we can make. And Bridget, I might just hand over to you then to speak to that bit of, from the adults that were around you as a teenager, what would have been helpful for you?
I think, and I had been considering this over the weekend after you sent me the question, but I think a lot of it would be the understanding that I'm not going to get it all at once, that this is going to be a slow process, even with learning how to take care of a changing body, how to understand what's going on with my brain and my classmates. I hid my periods from my mom for a while because I felt like I needed to have it figured out before I came to her because I had had troubles with different parts of interoception before. And we spent so much time trying to figure that out that she doesn't want to deal with me having another problem. And everyone else seems to know how to handle this, so I should too. And there was no real understanding that this is something that takes time. This is something that takes time for everyone. And it might take more time for you, and that's okay. And we can figure this out together. Um, I think also an understanding of very direct language. I don't know if it's just the time I was brought up in, but I was terrified of toxic shock syndrome, and no one would explain to me what too long meant. So I was terrified if I didn't take a tampon out after about 2 hours, which is too often. Um, but it sounded like the scariest thing in the world, and no one would give me a straight answer. So I just had to go on the least amount of time to make myself feel safe. So being very direct and allowing time. Um, I think also allowing them the space to understand what's the most important part to them, because there are a million things going on during these time periods. So so allowing them, if body odor is the thing that bothers them most, allowing them to tackle that first, even if you think that um a different part of it is more important, allowing them to have some amount of independence a very in a time that robs you of a lot of independence, especially if you had built up a little bit in the previous, I don't know, 10 to 14 years. Um, Also, keeping your eyes out to other options that didn't necessarily suit you. I know there was sort of an odd tribalism among female friends of like, well, my mom's a tampon person, or like, we're a pad household, that things that work for them might not be things that had worked for you, and there might be new options to research. Like, I know I'm focusing on periods quite a lot, but that's the main, most, I think, most traumatizing thing for young women, um, of period pants, or don't know what the non-branded term for diva cups are, but whatever the non-branded term for diva cups are, that their way of showering might not be the way that you shower. It might not be the time of day. It might not be the products that you use. It might not be the extent to which you shower, but it might be the thing that works for them.
Thanks, B. I'm actually just seeing, can I potentially set up another computer? So what I might do is I'm just going to bring you forward to this one, and just ask from your point of view while I look at the other computer. from a hygiene point of view, what are some of the ways as an autistic woman that I suppose you navigate hygiene and showering?
So I also mentioned this during our executive functioning webinar last year. Um, I use an app called Finch that reminds me with a little kind of uh, the other uh, late millennials, or I suppose they were around for a while, a sort of Tamagotchi style pet that reminds you to do your tasks. And it reminds me every 3 days to take a shower, which is one of my most hated tasks because it's so many separate steps. Um, there is a lot of executive functioning needed to take a shower. I always put it at the end of the day because I have such a recovery period afterwards that if I did it in the beginning of the day, if I was a morning shower, it would be like an 8 o'clock till noon operation. And that's just not how I can live. So I am very lucky at this point that I have a very understanding partner. He will occasionally, when I can't bring up the energy to shower, he'll body double for me, which is essentially just standing there and talking to me while I shower or just being there. It gives a certain amount of boost of energy just to have someone there. And obviously, for a teenager, that might not be the most applicable. But even if they can have, I know for myself, having someone talking, so even if it's just listening to a podcast or music that they like during a shower, to give them essentially something to fill up their brain other than the process and how stressful the process is. Um, uh, One tip that I actually got from Niamh was if you get a fluffy bathrobe or dressing gown, um, that you don't actually have to towel yourself all the way off. You can just get most of it and then put on a fluffy bathrobe, and that will get off most of it, which is very helpful for me because I've got some hypermobility and dyspraxia, so getting around to my back and my shoulders is always quite hard. And I always felt like I was doing it wrong, but it's like there are ways of managing this. Um, and then there's a whole half jokingly reward for being so brave. Um, get set up in bed with a tea and my laptop, and I get to engage with my special interests and just regain some humanity. Um, but the Finch, I think, is the most helpful for the brushing your teeth, getting ready in the morning, doing some amount of skincare, which my Finch has just started telling me to do because I have to do these things in the morning. And if you uh, put in that tell your Finch that you have done a certain amount of things in the morning, it goes off on its adventure and it discovers something new every day. Um, so if you do like 5 to 6 things in the morning, if you tick off, I brush my teeth, I brushed my hair, did my skincare, got dressed, made the bed kind of things all at once, then it immediately goes off on its little adventure, which is gets a nice dopamine rush right in the morning that I sent this little bird off on her daily adventure. Um, Toothbrushing is one that I have always, always had trouble with. Um, it genuinely was such a problem for me that it's one of the reasons that my first autism assessment got thrown out when I was 12, because they got to a part in the ADOS where they asked me to explain brushing my teeth as if I was talking to aliens. And what they were actually trying to do was like see hand positioning and see how I communicate to someone who wouldn't understand any of the cultural ideas of brushing your teeth. But what I thought they were doing was noticing that I was really bad at brushing my teeth and getting upset at me for it, that I wouldn't even be able to explain to an alien how to brush my teeth because I'm so bad at it. And I broke down and couldn't continue with the ADOS because I thought they were like watching me, and not in the way that they were supposed to be watching me, like they had cameras at home or something. Uh, and it had always been trouble. Some of it is the taste of toothpaste. I hate that intense mint. And one of my nieces is also autistic, and she would always describe it as too spicy. It is cold spicy, and definitely agree with her with that. So finding non-mint toothpaste, but they're also vague, which is a problem I found as an adult. Is that they're all so vague. Even the ones that don't say mint on them are mint. And there are different toothbrushes, but a lot of them are just like there's the double-headed toothbrush, which is supposed to make it happen quicker and get to the back of your mouth if you don't have the dexterity for that. There are soft bristled brushes, but I feel like all of it is just too much. Like there's no good way to put a brush in your mouth. There's no sensorily great way for that to happen. And there's a lot of shame around it. And especially since it's the first thing that so many people see, is it's so culturally obvious when it's done poorly. I think especially coming from an American context where perfect teeth are expected to the point that people wear extreme braces and extreme headgear. It was so scary to get it wrong. But giving myself a little bit of grace that if it's not 2 times a day, you're not a bad person. And we can make this work. And it doesn't have to be full happy birthday. If you just get all of the teeth at least once, that can be good enough. And then you can do it more the next day. And it doesn't have to be the same thing every time. And you can just have it take as long as it needs to take for your mouth to feel okay. So a lot of it is giving grace. How's your audio doing?
Is that okay, B?
Yep.
Okay, good stuff. I am pretty on my tech skills there. So I'm just going to go back. I just said that thing, and I cannot. So let me get this one. There we go. Okay. Look at
Niamh, audio is worse.
Is it? Okay.
Yep,
Is it worse even when I'm here?
it
Is that better?
is.
Is that better?
Getting now is better.
Okay, I'm just going to stay where I am here. I apologize for the no face. I'm just going between two different computers. Okay, so when it comes to something like a shower, particularly for someone who has executive functioning differences, all right? So that bit of struggling to start a task, to move through a task, to finish a task, etc. It seems like, listen, would you ever just hop in the shower for 5 minutes and then you'll be done? But that was me so that I could fit it in the slide, speaking quite broadly. And you can see the amount of transitions that are in there for a young person. So every word there in purple is a movement, a motor skill for our kids that are dyspraxic as well to take. If they also have sensory differences, they're coping with different sensory shocks from a tactile, an auditory, an olfactory, their nose, a visual. A shower is a multi-sensory experience. And then from an executive functioning point of view, they might be very focused on the rinsing their body and they're having to, I always picture it as shift the flashlight and move over then to the next part of that. Okay, now I actually, sorry, I have to pick up the razor and I need to get shaving. Oh, the shaving foam, etc. So I suppose the way I would look at it is of you want them to, you want your child so that, they don't run the risk of bullying or any kind of health issues, that their skin is clean as needs be, and they don't have a body odor. And yeah, I suppose that's the main focus, isn't it? So Bridget spoke to a lot of examples there, and I might just give another couple that might help. So for a young person that very much struggles going from wet to dry or hot to cold, making sure that you have the towel over the shower door so that they can put the towel on, and you can get a hook to do this before they get out of the shower. Bridget would have spoken to the dressing gown piece as well, which is actually something I learned when I was an OT student working with individuals who had chronic fatigue, because again, there's a lot less energy expended. The dressing robe does the drying for you. Again, if you know your child absolutely doesn't have it in them to shower and you want them to use wipes instead, maybe they're non-scented wipes, in the kind of medical shops, like your care shops, etc., you can get the body wipes that are adult size. So, your child isn't using 10 wipes to clean their armpits, etc. They are using large unscented wipes, and you can get them from a medical store. Even down to the piece of, if the compromise with your child is they use wipes to wipe their armpits, maybe clean their face, etc. Obviously, different wipes. Again, it's giving instructions in terms of the number of wipes. That might be something that's quite obvious to you. It might not necessarily be obvious to the young person. Bridget will have touched on this, but again, and again, it's going back to that bit of, if you know your child was more likely to respond well to plain foods, foods that melted in their mouth. They struggled with labels when they were little. They struggled with the feeling of zip on their skin. You might know they're then going to have more issues with tactile. So it's thinking what the sensory barrier is and how do I have a solution for that. Some children, from a sensory point of view, will struggle actually with being naked and the sensation of the air on their skin. So, is it, when you think of a granddad with those big old vests, the thing about putting a granddad's vest that size on a teenager is their armpits are very, very free and loose, and there is room for them to wipe around those areas. So maybe they won't get completely undressed, but will they be by themselves in by the sink or a wipe with a big vest like that, and they're getting their armpits, they're getting their genitals as well. Bridget spoke to the teeth brushing piece, and again, it's the flavorless toothpastes, etc. And there may be nothing that makes them feel good about a toothbrush in their mouth, but I know I've seen everyday OT before share a reel or a post on a toothbrush that has multiple sides to it, so that the toothbrush is in your mouth for the shorter length of time. And I think that worked well with Anya's child from memory. On the flip side, if your child is someone who is a sensory seeker or who doesn't seem to notice or recognize touch, actually having a toothbrush in their mouth can feel very, very frightening, because they may rely on their eyes. So a child who's quite clumsy, for example, and relies on their eyes when they're walking, if you take that sense away from them, so brushing the back of your head, having a toothbrush in your mouth, that's actually quite a frightening feeling. And sometimes that's why something like a vibrating toothbrush will actually work better, because it's adding more feedback and more control as well. Schedules, again, not just if you think, geez, my child definitely wouldn't use a visual schedule for the shower. He knows well that he's supposed to first wash his body parts, then add soap. Like cognitively, he knows that. Don't dismiss executive functioning differences. It is not that your child couldn't answer a test and say, first we do our armpits, next we X and Y. But if they have that executive functioning difference where they feel challenged by shifting from one activity to another, then actually the visual schedule isn't on, here's some pretty pictures of the activities. It is helping them make that transition as well. If for someone who struggles with deodorant as well, and you might have tried all different types, sometimes it might be the best you're going to get at the moment is actually putting the deodorant on the armpits of their top or their school shirt. It's obviously going to yellow the pits of it. I do know that. But actually, if you're thinking, I can't get deodorant near my child, they really struggle with it, actually that might be the best fix that you have at the moment. The hair dryer, again, a child who struggles to go from wet to dry, actually you might need to use or teach them to use the hair dryer on their skin to speed up that process for them. And then the sheets is there for, again, a child who is experiencing wet dreams and doesn't maybe know that actually they are going to need to change their boxers as well, or that their sheets are going to need changing as well. It may be a matter, but again, if your child isn't in a friendship circle where they're not having these discussions, and boys will discuss in a different way, but the discussion is still there. It's thinking about, is it just that you ask your teenage son if he thinks the sheet needs washing, and that could be for any reason, it's just clearing it to the bottom of the bed or whatever it is. But again, it's thinking about that piece of that may not be something he's expecting to happen, if that makes sense. I'm going to move. Then in terms of periods, again, Bridget spoke to a lot of that, and I've seen periods come in on the chat. Period pants have changed the game for so many autistic. I always think 10 years ago, I would love to have that as a solution to recommend for families. But I just wanted to do a quick potential flag of some children will struggle with the transition from going from kind of light underwear to the thick material of period pants. So if your child is kind of 8 or 9 or 10 and you're thinking this is coming at me in the next couple of years, or if they're 15 and you want to kind of move into trying period pants, which are going to be thicker, I would be thinking about when you're buying their other underwear, just going for as thick materials as possible. So there's less of a transition for them and building that up. For a child who is struggling with the fact that they were born with a female body, if that makes sense, periods can be a really, really difficult time, as they're a reminder that their body is acting in a way that they don't identify with. And period pants can be helpful with this in terms of it is much less visible that to you yourself, that you are on your period. And you can also get boxer shaped kind of briefs for period pants that your child might feel more comfortable as well. That picture of the cup with the moon on it was the closest I could get to the moon cup. And again, that is a helpful one from the point of view of, because you don't have to change it for, I think it's 8 hours. I've never used one myself. You have the benefit of, if you're a child who having a period upsets, because from a gender point of view, but also from an executive functioning point of view, you've got a longer time there. The downside there would be, obviously it can be a little bit finicky from a motor point of view. The wing, these things are there to remind me. The wing is there to remind me, if your child does use pads, we can be tempted to get the ones with the wings to help stick. But from a motor point of view, they require a higher level of fine motor skill. So they may not actually be a goer for you. The little 3 stripes of purple recognize pain there. An autistic child who has interoception differences or higher sensitivity is likely to feel period pain even worse than another child. So a lot of autistic women would speak to being gaslit when they were autistic teenage girls, where it was like, everyone has period pain, you're grand, but actually they may be feeling it much more acutely. And I suppose meeting them and believing them there. The hair bobbin is a little bit of a silly one, I suppose you could say, but equally, again, it is those things that we naturally expect a child to learn and can cause a lot of stress. So if your child is going to leave the classroom because they need to change their pad or their tampon, and from a social point of view, they may worry about, do I walk out with the tampon in my hand? Do I walk out with the pad in my hand? Is it in my pocket? Is everyone going to be looking at me? And from a motor point of view, they may find kind of tucking it into their sleeve quite difficult. So again, it's that teaching bit, teaching them the hair bobbin trick, where they can tuck a tampon or a pad into a hair bobbin on their wrist, and that keeps it close to their wrist, and then they can pull their sleeve down, and practicing that at home rather than a child feeling they can't get up and leave the room because what happens when everyone sees the tampon or the pad. The who I touched on earlier in the call, it is that piece of, does your child know who helps them when something goes wrong? And you can apply that far beyond puberty, but I think it's a missed trick a lot of the times for teenagers in secondary school. It's not as straightforward as primary school, when you know that you go to your primary school teacher and that they have the answer for you. It needs to be very, very obvious who is the person who helps, if that makes sense. Habits and routine, last point on this. We often talk about things, and this is kind of one, especially for our autistic ADHD, of that will just become a habit. A habit and a routine is a different thing. A habit for me is what? Washing my hands after I use the toilet. I don't consciously think time to wash hands. The water is on, it's motor memory. I don't even realize I'm doing it. That is a habit, and that takes a huge amount of time to form, particularly if you have a motor difference where motor memory is going to take longer to develop. So will develop a thinking that your child will develop a habit is a little bit like setting yourself up for disaster. It's needing to put in place a routine. Okay, after lunch, it doesn't become habit to change your pad. You change your pad after morning break and after lunch. So beware the habit trap, because that uh, sets often an autistic ADHD kid up. Okay, very quickly then, just on solution versus need. This is a bugbear of mine, right? Because autism is a business at the end of the day in terms of products, commercialized, etc. And when something is challenging, you might think, I need to buy everything that's out there. So just say, I'm trying to think of an example. Okay, your child is autistic, they have an intellectual disability, and you are trying to teach them that they can't put their hands down their pants in the classroom. And you see a set of visuals on Etsy that are for that purpose. But step back a little bit and think to yourself, okay, when we think of visuals, actually, it's often more meaningful for the child if it is a photograph rather than a line drawing. But it's not going to be appropriate, obviously, to have a picture of your child's penis on a visual schedule they use in school. But is it setting the child up for disaster if we have, God, if I've seen them once, I've seen them a million times, the two hands on the drawing of the penis and an X over it? If your child doesn't recognize that that is in any way connected to them, that pencil drawing, how then is it fair of them when it's like, oh, we've used the visual and it still hasn't had any effect? So there are so many solutions and strategies that I have said tonight, but they won't be effective for your child unless they relate to a need or a barrier. So if your child's challenge with periods is an executive functioning challenge in terms of being very, very enjoying being focused in English class and the debate, feeling, not noticing that they're starting to leak because all their hyper focus is in the activity. Pushing in something, like I don't know, pads that have odor control won't help them if they don't have a sensory issue. They need something to support them with a routine around changing their pad. So just beware the trap, I suppose, of there's so many solutions on the market, but do they actually relate to the need and barrier that your child has? Finally, and I refer to this all of the time. So this webinar isn't about friendship per se, and I believe it was Amanda McGuinness and Rachel O'Connor last year who did a webinar on friendship, and I'd absolutely encourage you to check that out or any of their webinars in fact. But I think it's also when we think of the challenges that the autistic child is going through in puberty, I need to finish on this from the point of view of the child is like everyone else trying to navigate this social jungle, their body changing, etc. But perhaps with the added complexity of they are needing to mask or hide who they are all day long. They may be desperate to stim, but they don't feel safe to go to the class to get up and bounce in their seat. And actually that then leaves them so drained that there isn't always that energy for friendship or for learning. I think we need to be careful with it's okay to unmask. There are certain populations where it's a lot more difficult to unmask. And for example, autistic children in the traveling community, where there may be already negative perceptions about their behavior. Sometimes it can be kind of white middle class who are saying, just unmask, everything will be fine. Unless you feel it's safe to do so in an environment, that's actually not particularly helpful advice. So a teenager unmasking might not be bouncing in their seat to stim. It might be knowing they can go to the bathroom to stim. And I just think we really need to meet the teenager where they are in terms of being different, standing up for themselves. Again, commend any teacher, any young person who can stand up and be themselves. Wasn't something I was able to do. I pretended I liked rap music for a number of years. I actually can't stand it. But I once, and some of you who know me on other webinars will have heard me say about what the teenager said to me, my mom keeps telling me it's great to be different, but she talks the same as her friends, she dresses the same as her friends, and she's all the same interests as her friends. I've never seen my mom stand up and be different. So why does she expect me to be okay being different? Absolutely, we want to celebrate difference, but I do think we need to meet the teenager where they are, whether that's being embarrassed by the fact that they have a laptop or an SNA or whichever it is. it's actually thinking about the impact that is having on the child and meeting them halfway, and the impact of masking through the day. And a young person who worked in the team resource with us actually drew this picture, and it went alongside an account of a teenager of talking about how they feel their bucket overflows through the school day. And the way they described it was very, very powerful in terms of getting up in the morning and the wrong detergent being on their sheets, and that making their bucket fill a little bit more. Their dad being very yappy in the car and their bucket filling a little bit more. Going into school and at lunch break, some of the boys are laughing at a joke, and the young person isn't sure if they are the part of the joke or they're being laughed at, and the bucket fills a little bit more. They then go into the last class of the day, and they need the toilet. And when they ask the teacher says, "Yeah, you just need to be back in 2 minutes." And they think, 2 minutes, and take it literally. I can't get back in 2 minutes. So they need the toilet and they hold on. They then go into form time at the end of the day, where they usually walk around during that. But because there's a spillage, they have to sit. They get in the car and dad is chat, 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 chat till they get home. And when they go in, their mum says, "How was the day, honey?" And they say, "F off, mum." And mum says, "Cripes. I only asked her how her day was." And the child says, "It wasn't just that you asked how my day was." So that impact on a teenager of masking full time in school can often be complicated by the fact they're not receiving support, because from the school's point of view, God, they seem absolutely fine. Is it something going on at home? And I picture it as, when your bath is full of water and it's too full, and you lift the plug for a second and it goes zoop, and a little bit of water goes out, and then you think, a little bit more, and you lift the plug again. Really, it's just because a child is masking doesn't mean that their environment isn't challenging them. A child breaking a window to get away from the noise to a child who sits frozen to cope with the noise is having the same barrier. And it is working with the school to understand that reasonable accommodations are still required, even when a child might appear to be coping. And I know that's not exactly connected to puberty, but when we think about everything else that's going on, I do just think that's to note. So it's 1933. So I'm ever so slightly over. And Bridget, I see you have been answering questions in there as well. Is there anything final you want to mention to me, Bridget?
To be fair, I always give you to half past. I know
I'm
you'll
chatter.
always go a little bit over. So
Yes,
there are a few questions about hair. There have been a lot of good answers in the
yeah, I can
chat,
see that. Yeah,
uh, talking about detanglers, satin pillowcases. I would also add that satin bonnets can be quite helpful. They're used predominantly in the Black community, but they can be also helpful. The main purpose of them is making sure that hair doesn't get tangled or matted during the night. Um,
absolutely. Tangle teaser has come up as well, which
yeah,
is a massive one.
I would say one that I didn't discover until I was an adult was um, I actually have an undercut now. I have very thick hair, so getting an undercut in the back to make sure that those mats always started at the back and bottom for me. So taking out the bit of hair that um, tangles and mats the most. Um, got a lot of questions on starting the conversation if a child completely does not want to talk about these things, but obviously they're very important topics, especially around self-care.
Yeah, and I think the team resource was really developed for that purpose in terms of the difficult conversation that's in print, and is probably much more explicit than any resource I've seen, in terms of not just an egg is released from the fallopian tube. It is much more in the day-to-day language as well. And I also think it's from that sex ed point of view of, kids are having sex ed in school, but it's often not adjusted to the autistic kid. And your child deserves the information to be just as accessible as another child who doesn't want to talk to their parents about puberty and learns about it in school, if that makes sense as well. We didn't actually talk much about bras, but I didn't see any particular question come in on that. But I actually we speak about that in the teen resource, so we might be able to
Mm,
focus on that. Um, okay, we better leave it there because I'm mindful of the time.
of
Um,
course. So if anyone has any other questions, they can be sent into the information line at support@asam.ie or 818-234-234. I will also be sending out a recording of the webinar tomorrow with some of the resources mentioned. And I think that's all, unless you have anything else you'd like to add.
oh, I'm making myself dizzy going from these two computers. But thank you so much, Everin, and thank you, Bridget, for hosting, and see you all again soon.